After Alexander became a top tycoon, the first thing he did was to keep me by his side. It wasn't because he loved me. It was to take revenge, but he didn't know. I actually didn't have long to live. 5 years ago, I learned that he had been diagnosed with a heart condition. He probably wouldn't live long. I immediately decided to break up with him. I even took all his money. He hated me very much. He placed me in a separate wing of the private school. I became his bedside companion. We were together every night. It lasted 3 months. After another sweaty night, he stood up coldly and looked at me coldly. He said, "You should know your place. Don't bother my fiancé." I slumped on the sofa, panting, and laughed softly. He got anxious and squeezed my chin hard. If Sophia wasn't weak, she couldn't have endured this. "What makes you think you can stay here?" Well, he hadn't finished speaking. I hurriedly nodded in agreement. I understand. Sophia is the most important thing in his heart right now. The moment I decided to donate my heart, I already knew I would never be able to be with him again. Alexander glanced at me. His expression was a little complicated. Then he picked up the clothes next to him and left. Before leaving, he coldly left a comment. "That scar on your chest doesn't look very good. In the future, cover it yourself. Don't let me see it. It's not a pleasant sight." I tilted my head. A little surprised, I asked, "Is this the first time you've seen it?" Looking back at the past 3 months, we always met in the evenings. He never liked the light on. He said he didn't want to see my face. He found it depressing. "I thought about it," I said calmly. "This is a scar from before I went to the foster home. My stepfather hurt me. It's got nothing to do with you. If you don't like it, don't come here in the daytime anymore." Alexander turned to look at me. Then he turned and left. I heard the door slam. I got up from the sofa with difficulty. I pulled the blanket next to me over me. I wrapped myself up tightly. I covered the obvious scars. He showed up almost every day. On the bed, sofa, kitchen, balcony. He used almost every corner of the house. Even when I was menstruating, he didn't stop. He always said, "I owe him this. It's my punishment for leaving him and taking all his savings." I once thought, maybe this will make him feel better. But a month ago, I suddenly found out I was pregnant. My good friend Daniel advised me to tell Alexander the truth as soon as possible. He loves me so much. He will definitely want to start over with me. But he already has a fiancé. "If you're embarrassed, I'll do it for you. Although you took all his money, it was all used for the heart transplant. If he knew that he was alive now because you donated your heart to him, he would definitely be good to you." Daniel finished speaking and walked on. I quickly ran over to him and pulled him back. "Don't tell him. I don't have much time anyway. If this baby is lucky, it can be born safely. I will have to ask you to take care of it. The doctor told me the artificial heart in my body can only be used for 10 years. Daniel knew about this. He looked at me with a face full of concern. He raised his hand, as if he wanted to touch my head, but in the end, he let it go. At that moment, my phone rang. It pulled me back from my thoughts. It was a message from Sophia. "Emily, if you are not at New York City KTV within 10 minutes, get ready to deal with Daniel's funeral." A video was attached to the message. As soon as I opened it, I saw Daniel being beaten by a few thugs while they held him down. His face, mouth, and nose were covered in blood. I quickly got dressed. I didn't even have time to brush my hair. I hurried to New York City KTV. I pushed open the door. At a glance, I saw Daniel lying weakly on the ground. Sophia stepped on his face with a cold smile. She said, "You still think you're the high and mighty CEO. It's different now. You're just a hostess. How dare you refuse me? You should be licking my shoes. That would be your great honor." I saw Daniel's brow furrowed in pain. I rushed over immediately. I pushed Sophia away, then gently helped him stand up. "Are you okay? It must hurt a lot." My tears were rolling in my eyes. My heart was full of guilt. If it weren't for the artificial heart for me, Daniel wouldn't have spent all our money. The company wouldn't have gone bankrupt. And he wouldn't be here now, serving drinks and being deliberately difficult. Sophia almost fell over when I pushed her, but instead of getting angry, she laughed. "Hey, Emily, you're so worried about your boyfriend. I'll give you a chance to show me how much you care. Drink this glass of wine, and I'll let him go." She raised the glass in her hand and looked at me with raised eyebrows. My heart sank. I felt that I couldn't avoid drinking this glass of wine today. Sophia has always liked Alexander. After she found out that Alexander and I were once a couple, she regarded me as an enemy. She tried every means to get back at me. Last time, she pretended to fall. She insisted that I had pushed her. When Alexander heard about it, he slapped me without saying a word. Then he dragged me into a room. He beat and scolded me. He hit me especially hard. I looked at the glass that was being offered to me. I touched my stomach and whispered, "I'm pregnant. I can't drink. Can't you think of another punishment? Are you kidding? If we could discuss it, it wouldn't be a punishment." Sophia crossed her arms and hugged her chest. She spoke in a dissatisfied tone. "Don't want a drink, do you?" Someone shouted. "Grab her." A few strong men came over. They held me down on the ground and made me kneel, and forcefully opened my mouth. Sophia put the glass on the table, picked up the remaining half bottle of wine, and poured it directly into my mouth. I coughed and choked on the wine. Lying on the ground, I kept retching. My chest heaved violently. I felt so uncomfortable that I almost fainted. Daniel climbed next to me and patted my back gently to help me calm down. He said, "Don't be afraid, it will be over soon." Sophia was wearing a long, bright red dress with stiletto heels. She bursts out laughing. "Ha ha ha, Emily, I never thought I'd see the day." A magnetic voice comes from the doorway. Sophia is so happy that she doesn't notice who it is. I can't help but look towards the doorway. I happen to catch Alexander's gaze in his neatly pressed suit. When our eyes meet, I can immediately feel him getting a little angry. That's right. I've upset his beloved Sophia. Of course he's not happy. Sophia stood up, twisted her slender waist, and threw herself into Alexander's arms. She blinked her big, wet eyes and looked at Alexander with a slightly aggrieved expression. She whispered, "Alexander, you're here. These two people make me very unhappy. You have to help me fix them." Alexander glanced at me and gave a cold smile. He said coldly, "Since you don't understand reason, you should be taught a lesson." He walked slowly towards me, his gaze fixed on Daniel's hand on my arm. "Take him away." The bodyguards stepped forward immediately. They pulled Daniel away. I held my breath. I quickly got down on my knees and begged for mercy. "I'm sorry. It's all my fault. Please let him go, I promise. I'll never bother Sophia again." Alexander didn't look at me. His face was grim. Anyone who knew him well knew that. It was a sign that he was about to lose his temper. The bodyguard had already removed Daniel's arm. His screams echoed around the room. However, Alexander showed no sign of stopping. He said coldly, "Keep hitting him until he can't scream anymore." I couldn't bear to see my benefactor being treated like this. I knew Alexander was doing this to vent his anger at Sophia, so I didn't hesitate to pick up the glass of wine on the table. I was prepared to face anything. Daniel saw what I was doing. He immediately shouted, "Emily, stop drinking. If you keep drinking, your child." The bodyguard felt that he was too noisy. He immediately covered his mouth. I secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, he didn't say what he wanted to say. "Sophia, I just refused you. I was inconsiderate. Please forgive me. Don't hold it against us." After saying that, I looked up. I was ready to finish the drink in one go. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm and took the glass from my hand. I was a little confused. I turned my head to look at Alexander, but I inexplicably felt a trace of happiness in my heart. Did he also feel a little distressed? Didn't want to see me being bullied. After all, the 3 years we were in love, envious of its sweetness, people who have truly loved. How could they willingly become enemies? Alexander's face fell. He said coldly, "Just drinking this glass. What kind of apology is that? There is no sincerity at all." He picked up the unopened bottle of 52% alcohol next to him. He handed it to me. He said coldly, "Drink this." I was taken aback. I didn't think he would go this far. This wine is particularly strong. It is usually used to make cocktails, but he wanted me to drink the whole bottle. "What are you still doing? Drink it. Otherwise, your sweetheart won't be able to hold on," Sophia said with a hint of schadenfreude. Daniel was already covered in bruises, but he still held on and kept shouting, "I can't drink, Emily. You can't drink that. Leave me alone. Even if I'm beaten to death, you can't drink." Alexander found it all too noisy. He kicked the bottle over. Daniel spat out a mouthful of blood. He was completely weak. I looked at him. My heart was in agony. Tears kept falling. I said in a trembling voice, "I'll drink it. I'll drink it now. Please let him go," I said, and quickly opened the bottle. I raised my head and gulped down the wine. I was afraid that if I hesitated for even a second, Daniel would be in danger. Halfway through the bottle, Alexander suddenly snatched it from me and slammed it onto the floor. He shouted angrily, "Emily, do you like him that much? For his sake, I'll drink the whole bottle. I never drink because I'm allergic to alcohol. Alexander knows that. But he still wants to punish me this way." Sophia steps over the broken glass on the floor. She goes over to Alexander, takes his arm, and says coquettishly, "Alexander, don't be so angry. She's just a woman who values money. I should be grateful that she left. That's how we got the chance to be together. Hearing her words, Alexander smiles. He gently tousled her hair, running his fingers through it. Sophia was right. People like that are not worth getting angry with. I was sweating from the pain. I pressed my hand to my stomach. Alexander glanced at me. His eyes were full of concern. His hand, which was resting on his waist, clenched into a fist. Sophia pointed at me, laughing. Emily, you're so funny. You don't think that this kind of self-harm will make Alexander soften his heart towards you. Besides, you don't even look convincing. It's just a bottle of wine. How could you possibly get a stomachache? When Alexander heard this, his furrowed brow first relaxed. Then it furrowed again. He stared at Emily and said, "How can you be so calculating?" The lights in the karaoke bar flickered nonstop. No one noticed the rash on my body or the cold sweat on my forehead. The only person who cared about me, Daniel, had already been knocked unconscious by them. The heat in the room was so intense that it made me gasp for breath. I looked at Alexander's delicate profile in the neon light. I suddenly remembered that rainy night 5 years ago. Back then, Alexander was soaked to the skin. He was huddled in front of the villa entrance, but he didn't dare to come in. He was clutching his laptop. The medical report in his suit pocket had been soaked in the rain and was already illegible. He explained, "The company's project failed. I was afraid you would be angry when you found out, so I stayed out here. I was afraid to go home. We grew up in the same foster home. We played together since we were young. We fell in love for 3 years. How could I not see that something was wrong with him? After investigating, I learned that he had a heart condition. He only had a few years left. I loved him dearly. I couldn't accept the fact that he would pass away. So, I hatched a daring plan and finally put it into action. Alexander was quite nice to me, so I casually asked him, 'Can you give me all your money?' He didn't hesitate and gave me all his money. I secretly took a heart-matching test. After confirming that I could save him, I broke up with him. Alexander strongly disagreed. I simply disappeared and took all his money with me, until the hospital informed him that a volunteer was willing to donate a heart to him. He was still mad at me. The operation used up all my savings. I thought I was going to die on the operating table, but I woke up again. Daniel spent all his money. He installed an artificial heart for me, so I can live another 10 years. Now, I really regret being so cruel to Alexander when I left. He probably will never forgive me. Daniel took care of me for 5 years. Then he worked as a hostess in a karaoke bar. During a heavy summer rainstorm, Alexander and I met again. I was sheltering from the rain outside the underground car park. He happened to be driving out in a luxury car. He saw me at once. I immediately began to atone for my sins. Amidst the loud music, someone suddenly shouted, "Oh my God, there's bright red blood sticking to her white dress." I was in pain and lying on the ground. My eyelids were heavy and I couldn't lift them. My ears were buzzing. Daniel's voice rang in my ears. He shouted, "Alexander, you've gone too far. Emily is pregnant with your child, and you let her drink. That's too much. Now she's bleeding heavily from the abortion. Take her to the hospital quickly." Hearing this, Alexander looked at me for the first time in a long time and shouted my name, "Emily." Sophia leaned limply on Alexander's shoulder and couldn't help laughing out loud. "Oh dear, Emily, you're getting more and more creative with your tricks. It's just your period. How can you even mention abortion? Is this the child you and Daniel conceived out of wedlock?" As soon as I finished speaking, Alexander's face instantly turned dark. He raised his hand and slapped me hard. "Emily, how could you be so shameless? For the sake of money, are you willing to accept anyone? You even want me to take the blame and say that the child is mine. Do you think I look that gullible?" Alexander's eyes were red. He stared at me, like a beast in the forest, as if he wanted to tear me to pieces. My face hurt, but the pain in my stomach was even worse. He never believed that the baby was his, because after every encounter he forced me to take the pill, but he didn't realize. The pill is not 100% effective. From the beginning to the end, I was only with him. Before losing consciousness, I fell into a warm embrace. When I woke up again, I was already in the hospital. I asked Daniel, "What happened next?" He said, "Alexander saw you faint, and without saying a word, carried you away. He took you to the hospital door and left, saying he didn't want to see anything happen to you. It's unlucky, and he told me to take good care of you." After he finished speaking, he quickly comforted, "Emily, don't be sad. I will always be by your side, even if the whole world abandons you. I will always be by your side." "Are you sad?" "Why would I be sad? My heart stopped beating 5 years ago. What's beating in my chest now is just an artificial heart. I forced a smile. My heart ached as I looked at the wound on Daniel's face. I'm fine now. You should go and treat your wound as well. He could have lived a very easy life, but because of me, experienced so much suffering for no reason. Maybe living these 10 years was a mistake. I watched Daniel gradually walk away. I reached out and unplugged the oxygen tube. I slowly walked to the windowsill. I was ready to jump. At that moment, I heard voices at the door of the ward. "Are you Emily's family? I have some bad news for you. She suffered heavy bleeding due to the miscarriage. The situation is not optimistic. Her body can't hold on much longer. She can last for a month at most. As a family member, I hope you can spend this last period of time with her. I understand." Daniel's reply sounded lifeless. He was struck by lightning. He stood there in a daze. Is it really hopeless? I decided not to commit suicide. There is only 1 month left. I want to do something meaningful. I told Daniel that I wanted to be discharged. He refused without hesitation. "No, your body is still weak. You must rest properly." I looked at him with a smile. I said calmly, "But this is my last month. I don't want to stay in this White House full of the smell of disinfectant." When I heard what I said, he froze for a moment, like a child who didn't know what to do. "You know everything." I remained silent. My gaze turned to the clear sky and the floating white clouds outside the window. "I miss home. Take me home to see it." "Okay," Daniel nodded seriously and agreed. That day I went back to the foster home. It happened to be raining heavily. The rain washed the peeling old wall of the foster home into a mottled mess. It seemed to wash away even my childhood memories. I sat in the car, pointing at the falling wall peeling. I said happily, "Daniel, do you remember when we were little, you, and Alexander? We often squatted in the corner of the wall to share things to eat, even if it was just a soda cracker. We were so happy." Daniel rested his hand on the steering wheel. He nodded and said, "Yes, we were really carefree when we were young. I remember one time, he and I got into a fight. As a result, the cookies fell to the ground. They were covered in dirt in the end. No one got to eat them. You broke the cookies into small pieces and gave them to us," Daniel said. His eyes were slightly moist. I patted his shoulder lightly. I said tenderly, Let's go in. Aunt Grace must miss us." Aunt Grace is the director of the foster home. She has worked hard to raise us. She is like our real mother and father. We all affectionately call her Aunt Grace. Daniel held a large black umbrella. He carefully sheltered me under it, making sure I didn't get a single drop of rain. We had just reached the door. Someone came out of the house. I recognized the person's face. I called out happily, "Aunt Grace." The person responded happily and hurriedly. Good kids, all good kids over the years. You three have been the most frequent visitors. Why isn't the boy Alexander with you? Aren't you all very close?" Upon hearing this, I smiled. I walked over and took hold of Aunt Grace's arm. I said coquettishly, "Aunt Grace, I want to eat the braised pork ribs you made." Just like when I was a child, I hugged her arm tightly and kept shaking it. Aunt Grace laughed. She patted my head lightly and said tenderly, You're already so big, but you're still so greedy for food. There are still ingredients in the kitchen. I'll make you something to eat. You go and play in the yard for a while." The heavy rain stopped quickly. Daniel and I stood by the railings, watching the children in the yard happily running around. It was like seeing us in the past. We didn't say anything, just silently watched. Suddenly, a child's voice came. "Look, a rainbow. Hurry up and make a wish." The children who were just noisy suddenly became quiet. Everyone put their hands together and closed their eyes. I looked up at the sky and really saw a rainbow hanging in the treetops. Aunt Grace called from the kitchen, "Come wash your hands. Dinner is ready." I sweetly said yes. As I turned around, I whispered to Daniel, "Don't tell Aunt Grace about me. I don't want her to worry." Daniel didn't say anything. He just nodded slightly. During dinner, he didn't say a word. He just buried his head in his food. It was as if this was the only way to hold back what he wanted to say. Aunt Grace kept me talking about all sorts of things. I heard that I was leaving after dinner. She seemed a little reluctant. I comforted her softly. "The weather isn't very good today. When the weather clears up, I will definitely come again." Aunt Grace gave her word again and again. Only then did she reluctantly let us leave. As we walked out of the foster home, Daniel looked at me earnestly and asked, "Emily, what are your plans next, no matter what you do? I will stand by your side." Looking at his serious expression, I felt full of guilt. He could have had a better life. He shouldn't be bound by the world for my sake. I shook my head. I didn't accept his kindness. "Daniel, you have already done a lot for me. I owe you too much. I can't repay you in this life. I can only repay you in my next life. There is only 1 month left. Leave me alone, okay?" Daniel was silent for a long time, pouted his lips. He finally agreed. I tried my best to force a smile. Say goodbye to him properly. I don't want him to remember me as a sad face in the future. After all, I was the life of the foster home. Daniel dropped me off at home and left. I could feel my health deteriorating. Now I was panting from climbing the stairs. I finally reached the front door. As soon as I opened it, I saw Alexander standing there. He had a stern face, sitting on the sofa and staring at me. "Emily, you've got some nerve. Your penance isn't over yet. How dare you just disappear?" After that, he strode towards me, grabbed me by the collar, and lifted me up like a chicken. "You've disappeared for a week. You should know how to apologize by now." I looked at him and smiled, and shook my head. I'm not sure. He was just the same as ever, always hiding his concern behind anger. But that's fine. Alexander impatiently threw me onto the sofa. He pounced on me eagerly. I begged him softly. "No, I'm very weak right now. I can't do strenuous exercise." He stopped undressing. He said coldly, "Hey, what's this new trick? Are you going to play the princess in a medicine jar? I don't have time to play with you." He started moving anxiously. He didn't even finish undressing. "Emily, you owe me all this. You can't refuse me." "Absolutely not." A sharp pain suddenly shot through my lower abdomen. I couldn't help but frown. I pushed him hard. I hoped he would stop. However, he didn't notice at all. He was still in the mood and kept shouting in my ear, "Emily, you can only belong to me. You can't be with anyone else." After it was over, he threw a pill at me as usual. I took it, without saying a word. I swallowed it. He looked at me and asked, "Alexander, are you interested in making a deal with me?" I looked at his back. My eyes suddenly became wet. He turned his head and asked me, "What kind of deal?" I quickly looked up at the sky. I didn't want him to find out that I had cried. "You give me 5 million. I'll go to your villa and stay with you for 15 days. I could have stayed with you for 25 days. But after what just happened, I've lost confidence." "Okay." Alexander responded immediately. He said coldly, "I'll give you the money in 15 days. In case you take the money and leave." He stared at me. His eyes were full of reproach, as if he were blaming me for what I had done before. I smiled lightly and said that this would not happen again in the future. The next day, I went to his villa as agreed. I arrived early. He had not yet woken up. I went to the kitchen, fried an egg, and heated up a cup of milk. Then I placed them in his study and left a little note. When he woke up, he walked into the study in his pajamas and saw the note at a glance. He tore off the note and, while reading it, picked up the fried egg and took a bite. "Emily," he called out my name loudly. I had been secretly watching from the side. Hearing him call my name, I immediately came out. "What's wrong?" I asked curiously. "Why?" Alexander said in a tone that left no room for discussion. "Starting tomorrow, I want to have this breakfast every morning." I nodded. I agreed readily. "Okay, I'll take care of it for the next 15 days. After hearing this, Alexander's chewing stopped suddenly. His good mood disappeared without a trace. He took a deep breath. In a calm tone, he said, "You know my taste. Please prepare lunch," he said. He put down the milk and left when we were together before. He loved the food I cooked. He always praised me as the best cook in the world. Even my boiled eggs tasted better than anyone else's. These past few days, he has been in a good mood. He even took me to play video games. That was my favorite in the past. But because of a heart problem, I haven't touched it since. Time really flies. The 15-day period is almost over. During our lovemaking, he whispered in my ear, "Emily, can you stay with me forever? But don't you already have a fiancé?" He kissed my collarbone softly and whispered, "What if I don't have a fiancé?" I smiled slightly and calmly said, "No way. I don't have much time left. How can I stay with him forever?" Alexander was silent. His actions became more rude. It was as if he was blaming me. He was sweating profusely. He handed me another pill. Then he got dressed and prepared to leave. I couldn't help but speak up. "Can you stay with me today?" Alexander got dressed and said coldly, "Emily, you are just a tool for me to vent my emotions. You are not qualified to rest with me." After saying that, he left. I watched his back gradually recede. My hand couldn't help but press against my chest. I originally thought I would feel pain here, but strangely, I felt nothing. The next morning, I suddenly had 5 million yuan in my bank account. I left with a sense of satisfaction. In my final moments, I gave my bank card to Daniel. I hoped that the 5 million yuan would help him get back on his feet, become the respected Daniel again. A week later, Alexander started sending people around to look for me. He came to my house several times, but he never saw me. Instead, he met Daniel, who came to clean my house. He looked at the dispirited Daniel and impatiently asked, "Emily broke up with you." This sentence was like a fuse, igniting the anger in his heart. Daniel rushed up like a bull, pushed Alexander to the ground, and punched him. "Alexander, what makes you think Emily liked you so much? What is it about you that she liked? She was willing to sacrifice her life to donate her heart to you. And you, what have you done for her?" Alexander heard these words and froze. "What did you say?" "Emily donated her heart. She saved my life. That's impossible. Absolutely impossible." I asked the attending doctor. He said the person who saved me wasn't Emily. He pushed Daniel away sharply with a face full of impatience. Daniel swung at him again and rebuked him sternly. "You're so stupid. She won't live long with a donated heart. Of course she won't tell you. If I hadn't spent all my money, I would have installed an artificial heart for her. Do you think you'll ever see her again?" Hearing this, Alexander was completely stunned. For a long time, he shook his head vigorously, clutched Daniel's shoulders, and shouted, "No, I don't believe it. You must be lying together. She lied to me like this before. You let me see her. I want to confront her face to face. It was Sophia who saved me. Don't even think about lying to me." Daniel was furious. He raised his hand and slapped the other man. It was too late. An artificial heart only has a lifespan of 10 years. After Emily's miscarriage, the heart could no longer withstand the strain. It had already died. Alexander's words were like a bomb thrown into the water. They instantly stirred up huge ripples. He stood there motionless. His eyes were vacant, completely forgetting to resist. He let Daniel vent his anger. After a while, Daniel had had enough. He turned and walked away. Alexander returned to the company like a lost soul. He immediately arranged for someone to investigate Sophia. He had never really liked Sophia. He had only married her to repay a debt of gratitude. After Sophia produced the donation certificate, Alexander was convinced that she had saved his life. After he heard the news about me, he rushed to the hospital. The morgue was cold and creepy, but Alexander was not afraid. He gently placed his hand on my pale face and whispered, "Emily, why didn't you tell me? I only love you. You're the only one in my heart. I was nice to Sophia. I was actually trying to make you come back to me. Don't you like being jealous the most? I thought if I did that, you would leave Daniel and come back to me. Emily, please wake up. I know I was wrong. I will never do anything like this again. And there's our baby. If you wake up, we'll have another one." "Okay," he said, tears falling uncontrollably. At that moment, there was a sound of footsteps at the door. A doctor in a white coat was walking over from the freezer. He was holding a tray. Inside was a black artificial heart. The heart was beating softly in the liquid. He was the doctor who had performed the heart transplant on Alexander earlier. He said to Alexander, "Alexander, please accept my condolences. Emily hopes you can continue to live. You don't need to feel sad about it." He said that and left. At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. "Alexander, we found out that Sophia's donation certificate was forged." After reading the message, Alexander's face turned pale. He sent Sophia a message of his own initiative. "Are you free? I'll come pick you up for dinner." Sophia replied happily, "Of course I am. Just come pick me up at 6 o'clock. She dressed up elaborately. She put on her full makeup, sprayed on some perfume, and put on a very attractive dress. When Alexander picked her up, he didn't take her to a restaurant. Instead, he walked further and further into the countryside. "Alexander, aren't we going to dinner? Why are we walking in the mountains?" Sophia swallowed nervously. She asked timidly. Alexander didn't say anything. He slammed on the brakes and pulled over next to a cave. He unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the car. He walked over to the passenger's side and pulled Sophia out. "Alexander, you're hurting me," Sophia shouted. Alexander gave her a cold stare, and Sophia immediately fell silent. He led Sophia into the cave and took a baton from the boot, quickly followed. Sophia was terrified by this sudden move. Her legs felt weak. She trembled and asked, "Alexander, what are you doing? I'm scared. Take me away. Go. Today is the end for you," Alexander said. He hit her on the leg with a stick. She couldn't move anymore. Sophia cried out in fear. She kept asking, "Why? Why are you doing this to me?" Alexander stared at her with bloodshot eyes. His eyes were fierce. He kept swinging the stick, hitting her again and again. "How dare you ask why? If it weren't for you forging the donation certificate and forcing me to marry you out of gratitude, Emily and I would never have been separated. If it weren't for you." After Emily and I were reunited, we could have at least been happy for 5 more years. It's all your fault. You made me do so many things to hurt Emily. She will never forgive me. In that case, go down there and apologize to her properly. Slowly, Sophia stopped talking. Alexander stared at the mess in front of him. Finally, he stopped moving. He threw away the stick in his hand. He walked over to the car. He lit a cigarette. After he finished smoking, he drove to the foster home. Aunt Grace happily took out a photo. In the photo, 3 scruffy-looking children were huddled in front of a tin house. The girl on the far right was dividing the last cookie into 2 halves. Aunt Grace said, "You 3 children are really the most thoughtful. The other day, Emily and Daniel came to visit me. I just didn't expect Emily to leave so soon. This photo is from Emily. Please keep it as a memento." At that moment, there was a loud thunderstorm outside the window. It seemed that the heavy rain from 10 years ago was continuing. Alexander took the photo. His hand trembled. The photo fell to the ground. The writing on the back was revealed. It was written by Emily to Alexander. "When you read this letter, I will have already turned into a star in the sky. Don't be sad. Remember the little girl with the dirty face. Now she is finally shining. Be proud of me." In the distance, he could hear the sound of children playing. He suddenly remembered the day of the operation. The nurse told him. The volunteer who donated her heart to him kept singing a nursery rhyme softly before the operation. The evening breeze gently blew through the treetops. The familiar melody was faintly audible. He smiled to himself. He said to himself, "I was so stupid. I knew it all along. The person who donated their heart to me was actually you. But I believed Sophia's lies. And I hated you for it for so long. It's been a long time. I'm actually really happy. But on the surface, I still pretended to be fine. It's my fault. It's all my fault. I underestimated your love for me, Emily. Forgive me. Okay, if there is a next life, I will treat you well and make you the happiest woman in the world." No one answered him. A gust of wind blew. A few leaves fell. He bent down and picked up one of them. Between the lines on the leaf, he could faintly see a small line of text written in highlighter. "Live well. Remember, someone gave up an entire spring for you." He recognized Emily's handwriting. Until the day she died, she had hoped that he would live a good life. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. He held the photo close to his chest. "Emily, I'm sorry. I may have let you down again." With those words, he started the car and drove straight into the lake. "Emily, wait for me. I won't leave you alone again." The next day, a news report came on the TV. The richest man in the country, Alexander, was suspected of drunk driving. He accidentally drove his car into the lake. When the rescue workers fished him out, he was already dead. Surprisingly, he was still holding a photo in his arms. Meanwhile, Daniel unexpectedly became the legal heir to all of Alexander's property. It was rumored that this was Alexander's own wish.